He didn't swing a sword or order an executioner. He simply nodded, and guards dragged traitors to the Nile, where crocodiles waited to tear them apart alive. This is the story of the pharaoh who fed his enemies to crocodiles. The Nile. For thousands of years, it's been the lifeblood of Egypt, a sacred river that turned the desert green and gave rise to one of the greatest civilizations on earth. The gentle currents carried the barges of pharaohs, and its waters created a paradise. But the Nile has always kept a dark secret. Just beneath its shimmering surface, a silent, armored predator has reigned since the dawn of time. An ancient creature of immense power and terrifying violence, the crocodile. To the ancient Egyptians, this apex predator wasn't just an animal. It was a god, a symbol of the pharaoh's power, and a protector of the entire realm. But somewhere in the shadows of history, a story began to spread. A story that turned this divine protector into a terrifying instrument of justice. It was a tale of a pharaoh so ruthless that he turned the sacred crocodiles of the Nile into his personal executioners. Ancient whispers tell of a pharaoh who fed his enemies to the crocodiles. A political rival, a captured spy, a treacherous member of his own court. Anyone who dared to stand against him would meet their end not by a sword, but in the crushing jaws of a reptile. So, was this a real practice, or just a dark legend cooked up to keep people in line? Was there truly a crocodile pharaoh? We're going to investigate the shocking story of a pharaoh named Sobekhotep and find out what's true and what's not. The legend doesn't point to just any pharaoh. It points to a name that's a power move in itself, Sobekhotep, which means Sobek is satisfied. And Sobek? He was the great crocodile god. The story paints a chilling picture of Egypt during a time of chaos, the Second Intermediate Period. The unified strength of the old days was fraying. Dynasties rose and fell so fast it would make your head spin, and holding onto the throne was a dangerous game. In a world this volatile, a pharaoh needed to project absolute authority. The legend says Sobekhotep wasn't just a ruler. He was a force of nature, as final as the river itself. His court was a place of secrets and schemes, but treason carried a death sentence of unimaginable horror. Imagine a prisoner dragged from the dungeons. But he's not taken to a chopping block in the public square. He's taken to the banks of the Nile, maybe to a walled-off pool in a temple, where the dark shapes of huge crocodiles glide silently through the murky water. The story says these weren't just wild animals. They were the pharaoh's chosen few, well-fed, revered as living gods, their golden eyes locked on the trembling figure before them. There's no trial in this story, only a verdict. The pharaoh, sitting on his throne, just nods. A guard shoves the condemned forward. A splash, a vortex of churning water, a brief, desperate struggle, and then silence. The god Sobek has been satisfied. The pharaoh's power is undeniable. It's an incredible story, and it served a purpose. It was a warning, a piece of political theater meant to terrify anyone who might think about challenging the king. It made the pharaoh more than a man, tying him directly to the most feared god of the Nile. To defy Sobekhotep was to literally offer yourself as a sacrifice to his patron god. It's a powerful image, the perfect piece of ancient propaganda. But propaganda isn't history. To find the truth, we have to peel back the layers of myth and look for the real man at the center of this terrifying tale. To get to the bottom of this legend, we first have to understand the world that could have created it. The pharaoh in question, Sobekhotep, wasn't just one person. It was a name used by several rulers during Egypt's 13th dynasty, which kicked off around 1800 BC. This was the start of what historians call the Second Intermediate Period, a name that basically means things were falling apart. For a long time, scholars saw the 13th dynasty as pure chaos. You had a dizzying number of short-lived kings, one after another. Think about it. Over 50 rulers in about 150 years. Some were on the throne for just a few months. That kind of turnover screams political instability. The solid, unquestioned power of the pharaohs who built the pyramids was a distant memory. But recent archaeology paints a more complicated picture. While kings were swapping out at the top, the day-to-day government of Egypt kept chugging along. The bureaucracy was still running, so it was less of a total collapse and more of a slow decay. Power was spreading out, local governors were getting stronger, and foreign settlers, the Hyksos, were building their own power base in the Nile Delta. This is the perfect breeding ground for a legend like the Crocodile King. When a pharaoh's actual power is weakening, the power of symbols and terror becomes way more important. A ruler in a shaky position needs to look absolutely terrifying, even if the reality is much more fragile. And what better way to do that than to tie yourself to the ultimate predator lurking in the Nile? That fact alone is fascinating. A pharaoh from a non-royal background would have an even greater need to prove he belonged there and project strength. Yet, what he left behind shows not a monster, but a pretty standard pharaoh. He ruled for only about 4 years. In that time, he did what pharaohs do. He built things. He added to the temple of the war god Montu and built a chapel at El Kab. There's a beautiful relief in the Brooklyn Museum that shows him making offerings to goddesses, looking every bit the pious king. There are no records of mass executions, no hints of unusual cruelty, and definitely no mention of crocodiles being used as state-sanctioned killers. The man we find in history is a builder and a worshiper, a king trying to hold things together. He seems a world away from the bloodthirsty tyrant of the legend. So, if the man doesn't fit the myth, where did the myth come from? To answer that, we have to look away from the pharaoh and toward the god whose name he carried. We need to understand the immense, terrifying power of Sobek. The Nile crocodile is a terrifyingly efficient killing machine. It can grow up to 20 feet long and weigh almost a ton. Ancient Egyptians lived their lives on and in the Nile. They fished in it, they bathed in it, they traveled on it. They knew exactly what kind of danger was lurking just below the surface. A moment of carelessness at the water's edge could mean a sudden, violent end. So it's no surprise that the god who took the form of this creature was one of the most complex and feared in Egyptian religion. This was Sobek. His worship was ancient, going all the way back to the pyramid texts. But he wasn't some one-dimensional monster. Sobek was a god of two sides. As a crocodile god, he was tied to the Nile. Since the river's annual flood brought fertility to the land, Sobek was seen as a god of fertility and life. Some myths even said the Nile was formed from his sweat. Because of his raw power, he was also a patron of the military and a divine protector of the pharaoh. The king's strength was the strength of Sobek. Having the crocodile god on your side meant having the untamable power of nature as your bodyguard. Taking the name Sobekhotep, Sobek is satisfied, was a huge statement. It declared that the king was the chosen agent of this mighty god. But there was a darker side. Sobek was also chaotic and unpredictable. One of his titles was the Rager. He represented the raw, animal violence of a crocodile that kills without reason. In some myths, his father was Set, the god of chaos who famously murdered his own brother, Osiris. In one story, after Set chopped up Osiris's body, it was Sobek who ate some of the pieces, an act so disrespectful he was punished by having his tongue cut out. So Sobek was both a creator and a destroyer, a protector and a mindless predator. You had to worship him, but you also had to appease him out of fear. And nowhere was this worship more intense than in the Fayum oasis. The Greeks were so blown away by the local obsession with the crocodile god that they named the main city Crocodilopolis, the city of the crocodile. Here, the worship of Sobek was on another level. Temples kept live crocodiles in sacred pools. These weren't just animals, they were living incarnations of the god. The most famous was a crocodile named Petsuchos, meaning son of Sobek. Ancient writers like Herodotus described him as a pampered god, decked out in gold jewelry and hand-fed by priests. When these sacred crocodiles died, they were mummified with the same care as a person, wrapped in fine linen and buried in special cemeteries. Archaeologists have found thousands of crocodile mummies, from huge adults to tiny babies, suggesting a full-scale breeding program for these sacred animals. This deep cultural reverence, a mix of awe and terror, shows us how central the crocodile was to the Egyptian mind. They were living symbols of divine power. It's here, in the cult of Sobek, that we find the second piece of our legend. We have a real king named after the god, ruling in a time of chaos. And we have a culture that deified the very creature he was named for. The pieces are starting to fall into place. But one big question remains. Is there any proof that the Egyptians ever took that final, horrifying step? If you're going to have a legend about a unique form of execution, you have to see how it stacks up against the real thing. The Egyptian legal system was surprisingly advanced, built around the idea of Ma'at, the divine principle of truth, order, and balance. For smaller crimes, punishments were often fines or beatings, famously, 100 strikes to the soles of the feet. For more serious crimes, like adultery or robbing a grave, the punishments got much worse, like having your nose or ears cut off. For the worst crimes against the state or the gods, treason, rebellion, or messing with a royal tomb, the death penalty was on the table. And the Egyptians were not squeamish. They used a variety of brutal methods designed to be a public warning. We have reliefs and texts that show or describe executions by beheading, being burned alive, or, maybe worst of all, being impaled on a sharpened stake. But what about crocodiles? If you search online for ancient Egyptian punishments, plenty of sources will list being fed to crocodiles as a method of execution. At first, this seems like the smoking gun, but you have to be careful. These lists rarely point to a specific ancient text where a pharaoh formally sentences someone to this fate. There are no carvings of a crocodile execution like there are for impalement. So where does the idea come from? It probably comes from a more practical, but no less horrifying, reality. For certain crimes, a common sentence was to be denied a proper burial. To an Egyptian, this was a fate worse than death itself, because it meant your soul couldn't reach the afterlife. And one easy way to make sure that happened was to have the condemned thrown into the Nile. Drowning was a recognized form of execution. And what happens to a body thrown into the Nile? Well, in many cases, it would be eaten by crocodiles. It's completely plausible that a judge could sentence a traitor to be cast upon the water, knowing full well what would happen next. In that case, the crocodiles aren't official executioners. They're just the terrifying, natural consequence of the sentence. The result is the same. A brutal death and the body is gone forever, but the official story is different. It's not a pharaoh's personal hit squad of reptiles. It's the raw, unforgiving justice of the river itself. This little distinction might be the key to the whole mystery. The history shows a normal king. The religion shows a culture that both worshipped and feared a crocodile god. And the law shows a system that used the Nile as a place of punishment. None of these things alone confirm the legend. But when you weave them all together, a new picture starts to form. A picture of how history, belief, and fear can cook up a myth far more powerful than the truth. The stories of ancient Egypt are filled with incredible tales of gods, monsters, and divine kings. Separating fact from fiction is one of the greatest challenges for historians today. If you enjoy diving into these ancient mysteries and uncovering the real stories behind the legends, make sure to subscribe to our channel and click the bell icon so you don't miss our next investigation. So, did Pharaoh Sobekhotep feed his enemies to crocodiles? After looking at all the evidence, the verdict is pretty clear: almost certainly not. There's just no credible proof that Sobekhotep III, or any other pharaoh, kept crocodiles as official state executioners. The story, as it's told, is a legend. But calling it just a legend misses the point. This myth is a powerful cultural artifact, born from a perfect storm of history, religion, and primal fear. Let's imagine how it was born. First, you have the time period, the 13th dynasty, a time of weak central power. A king on a shaky throne needs to look strong. Second, you have the man, a pharaoh named Sobekhotep, a name that literally ties him to the power of the crocodile god. He's telling the world he's protected by a god of life, death, and uncontrollable force. Third, you have the god himself, Sobek, the fearsome deity who is both worshipped and feared, with live crocodiles treated as gods in his temples. Fourth, you have the real, everyday danger, the thousands of wild crocodiles in the Nile that were a constant threat to anyone living near the water. And finally, you have the justice system, a system that already used brutal punishments and likely threw people into the Nile as a death sentence, where crocodiles were the inevitable cleanup crew. Now, put yourself in the shoes of an ancient Egyptian. You see a pharaoh named for the crocodile god. You know the terrifying power of that god. You see the real crocodiles in the river every day. And you hear that traitors are sentenced to be thrown to the water. It doesn't take much of a leap to connect those dots. The story practically writes itself. The mundane reality of a sentence of drowning gets twisted into a much better story. The pharaoh, a living god, commands his sacred animals to carry out his justice. The legend of the Crocodile Pharaoh isn't a lie. It's a metaphor that got taken literally. It's the ultimate power story, a piece of folklore that perfectly captures the idea of a pharaoh's absolute authority. The truth isn't that Sobekhotep was a monster who fed men to beasts. The truth is he was a ruler in a troubled time who used the image of a monster to project power. Over time, the man and the symbol merged, until the legend became more real than the history. And it's a good reminder that sometimes, the most terrifying monsters aren't the ones in the water, but the ones we create in our own minds to make sense of a chaotic world. If you thought the tale of the Crocodile Pharaoh was horrifying, wait until you hear about the emperor who turned death into entertainment. A ruler who sat on a golden throne and laughed as prisoners were thrown to lions for sport. Click the link above to witness the reign of terror of the emperor who fed prisoners to lions for sport.